January 17, 1945. A bitter wind swept across the skeletal ruins of a small German town. Chimneys stood like broken fingers against a slate-gray sky, and snow lay in patches over rubble-strewn streets. The smell of smoke and decay hung in the air, punctuated by the faint, acrid scent of rationed coal burning in makeshift stoves. Women huddled around sparse fires, their hands red and cracked from cold, while children clutched tattered blankets, eyes wide with a mixture of hunger and fear. For months, they had endured shortages, air raids, and the constant uncertainty of war. The distant rumble of tanks echoed through the valley, and hearts jumped at the sound. And then came the unfamiliar, almost surreal sight, a convoy of American trucks rolling cautiously into the town square, dusting the snow with black tracks. Soldiers stepped down, faces stern yet careful, carrying boxes of food, blankets, and a strange, tantalizing aroma. Roasted turkey, spiced pies, and the unmistakable smell of coffee. The women froze. For a brief moment, the devastation and hardship around them seemed to pause, replaced by a flicker of disbelief. Could kindness exist amid such ruin? And why were they here? These soldiers offering warmth, food, and invitation. By early 1945, the Third Reich was crumbling. German cities lay in ruin, scarred by relentless Allied bombing campaigns and the grinding advance of enemy armies on multiple fronts. The once formidable Wehrmacht had been shattered in the east, and the western borders were porous, with American and British forces pressing into the Rhineland. Civilians faced starvation, disease, and the constant threat of violence from both retreating German soldiers and advancing armies. Across the towns and villages of southern Germany, life had narrowed to survival. Food was rationed, often supplemented with what could be scavenged from bombed-out markets or frozen fields. Coal and firewood were scarce. The transportation network was in tatters, and many rural families were cut off from urban centers where aid might have reached. Women, children, and the elderly bore the brunt of hardship, tending to fragile homes and families while the men were conscripted, killed, or taken as prisoners of war. Into this landscape came the Americans, carrying a complex mission, not only to defeat the enemy, but also to stabilize liberated areas and prevent humanitarian collapse. The United States Army had learned from experience in France and Belgium that civilian goodwill was essential for occupation, intelligence, and the long-term restructuring of society. Officers were tasked with distributing rations, medical aid, and clothing, sometimes improvising solutions in towns stripped bare by war. The idea of hosting a Thanksgiving dinner in German territory came as part of this broader policy of goodwill. Traditionally celebrated in the United States as a time of gratitude and family, the dinner had a symbolic purpose here, a gesture of humanity extended to former enemies. Soldiers were trained to approach these interactions with care, aware that cultural sensitivity could ease tensions. It was a calculated mix of empathy and diplomacy, grounded in both moral responsibility and military strategy. The civilians themselves were cautious. News of Allied generosity traveled slowly, and rumors were met with skepticism. German propaganda had spent years painting the Americans as invaders, looters, or cruel occupiers. In reality, many soldiers approached towns quietly, leaving behind leaflets explaining their intentions and demonstrating non-aggression through small acts of aid. For women in particular, this was a bewildering reversal. They were accustomed to suspicion and fear. To receive food, warmth, and an invitation to a shared meal was almost unimaginable. Geographically, this particular town, like many others in Bavaria and the Rhineland, was chosen for its symbolic and logistical value. It was accessible to supply lines, relatively intact in terms of infrastructure, and had a population large enough to make the Thanksgiving gesture meaningful. The arrival of trucks, the unloading of supplies, and the careful coordination of a communal meal required planning and collaboration across military and civilian sectors. Military engineers and logistics officers mapped routes for supply convoys, while officers liaised with local representatives, often women or community elders, to ensure that distribution was orderly and inclusive. For the German women, the context was staggering. Months of deprivation, punctuated by occasional Allied bombings, and now a carefully orchestrated act of generosity. The historical backdrop added layers of disbelief. These soldiers, strangers from foreign land, were not only bringing necessities, but also sharing a cultural ritual entirely foreign to the town, one that carried the weight of ceremony, gratitude, and celebration. To accept meant confronting both hope and shame. Hope for immediate relief, shame for receiving kindness from those who had been enemies. At this moment, the civilians were suspended in a strange, emotional limbo. Their daily routines of survival had been upended, yet the prospect of food and warmth hinted at something beyond survival. Dignity, recognition, and the faint, fragile possibility of reconciliation. It was in this intersection of despair and hope that the story of the Thanksgiving dinner would unfold, revealing both the human capacity for resilience and the unexpected gestures that could bridge divides even in the shadow of war. The tension of disbelief among German civilians set the stage for the deeper, layered exploration of life under occupation, Allied strategies, and the human responses to these gestures of mercy. Understanding this environment is essential to grasp why a simple invitation to dinner could feel extraordinary, almost surreal, to those who had endured years of conflict. By January 1945, the rhythm of daily life for German civilians had narrowed to the barest necessities. Women carried the responsibility of maintaining households that had been fractured by war. Their husbands, brothers, or fathers were either conscripted, killed, or imprisoned, leaving them to navigate a world of shortages, ration cards, and cold, unheated rooms. Children often went without adequate clothing or food, and illness was a constant threat. In towns partially destroyed by bombing raids, streets were impassable, schools shuttered, and social structures decimated. Food shortages were pervasive. Bread, potatoes, and occasionally canned goods formed the foundation of meals, but even these were unreliable. Milk, eggs, and meat were luxuries reserved for those fortunate enough to live in rural areas with access to private farms. Urban civilians relied heavily on government rations, but these were insufficient to sustain families through harsh winters. Many women resorted to scavenging from ruins or exchanging small possessions for scraps of food. The effort to maintain dignity under such circumstances was constant and exhausting. The presence of American troops in these zones introduced a disorienting contrast. Unlike advancing German forces, whose passage was often associated with fear and requisition, American soldiers carried food, clothing, and medical supplies intended for civilians. Their mission included not only logistical support, but also the psychological management of war-torn populations. Officers understood that gestures of kindness could reduce hostility, prevent uprisings, and foster cooperation. Yet for civilians conditioned by years of propaganda and fear, such generosity was met with cautious suspicion. Women, in particular, experienced this dichotomy acutely. Many had suffered sexual harassment, violence, and intimidation at the hands of both retreating German units and advancing armies. To approach American soldiers with an open mind required both courage and pragmatism. Some observed from doorways or windows, watching the careful distribution of blankets and hot meals. Others, weary of starvation, approached directly, holding children in their arms, hesitant but compelled by hunger. Amid this environment, the idea of a Thanksgiving dinner emerged. Rooted in American cultural tradition, Thanksgiving symbolized gratitude, family, and togetherness. In the context of wartime Germany, it was reimagined as a humanitarian act, an opportunity to offer warmth, nourishment, and a semblance of normalcy to civilians who had endured years of fear and deprivation. Military planners coordinated with local intermediaries to identify recipients, prepare food in field kitchens, and establish dining areas that could accommodate hundreds safely. It was more than a meal. It was a carefully orchestrated message of goodwill. The dinner was an anomaly in the pattern of war. Soldiers, trained in discipline and survival, now became hosts and facilitators of a ritual foreign to their surroundings. Recipes were adapted to available ingredients, with turkeys roasted over field stoves, vegetables drawn from supply depots, and desserts like pumpkin pies improvised with ration sugar. Tables were set as best as possible amid snow-dusted squares or partially ruined halls. The sensory impact, the smell of roasted meat, the warmth of a fire, the sight of children receiving treats, created an atmosphere that was both comforting and surreal. German civilians, especially women, found themselves navigating conflicting emotions. Relief and gratitude mingled with disbelief and shame. To accept kindness from former enemies challenged their worldview, cultivated over years of nationalist rhetoric. Yet the tangible reality, hot food, blankets, clean clothing, could not be ignored. In this liminal space, human empathy and survival instincts intersected. Women cautiously allowed themselves to imagine warmth and security, even if temporarily, while children's wide-eyed fascination brought a fleeting sense of innocence back to streets scarred by war. This environment also reflected the broader policy goals of the Allies. Psychological operations emphasized the humanity of American forces to encourage cooperation and reduce resentment. Photographs of these dinners, letters home, and reports filed by officers documented not only the practical success of aid distribution, but also the emotional resonance of the gesture. It became a symbol of the moral dimension of occupation, that acts of generosity could bridge divides, foster understanding, and leave lasting impressions even in the shadow of destruction. By understanding the daily hardships and emotional terrain of these German civilians, the extraordinary nature of the Thanksgiving invitation becomes clear. What might seem a simple social gesture in peacetime carried profound significance in a war-torn world, a moment of recognition and humanity that temporarily suspended fear, suspicion, and deprivation. The stage was set for the American soldiers to enter this frozen landscape, not merely as occupiers, but as bearers of warmth, food, and the possibility of reconciliation. A scene poised for emotional intensity, human connection, and historical significance. Human perspective. For the German women, the arrival of American soldiers was an emotional paradox. Months of deprivation, uncertainty, and fear had conditioned them to expect only hardship. To see strangers bearing gifts, meals, and blankets challenged every instinct honed by survival. Their initial reactions were a mixture of disbelief, suspicion, and tentative hope. Some clutched their children tightly, unsure whether to accept the food or retreat into the shadowed corners of their ruined homes. Others approached cautiously, drawn by hunger yet wary of cultural or political repercussions. The psychological impact of this encounter was profound. The women experienced a temporary suspension of fear, replaced by a rare sense of recognition and humanity. Simple acts, offering a blanket, smiling at a child, or extending a hand, became emotionally charged gestures. In the middle of a war-torn town, these women confronted the reality that not all Americans were enemies, and that empathy could transcend the boundaries of conflict. This human reaction, captured in photographs and memoirs, underscores the intersection of survival, trust, and emotional recalibration during occupation. Tactical perspective. From a military standpoint, the Thanksgiving dinner was part of a broader strategy to stabilize occupied territories. Tactical planning ensured that civilian gatherings were conducted safely, minimizing risk to both soldiers and civilians. U.S. officers identified towns where logistical feasibility aligned with symbolic value. Supply lines were mapped to guarantee timely delivery of food, while coordination with engineers ensured safe access for trucks and field kitchens. Soldiers were briefed on potential hazards, from leftover landmines to hostile or suspicious civilians, and measures were taken to prevent panic or disorder. The tactical consideration went beyond mere logistics. It was about maintaining morale among both troops and civilians. By demonstrating discipline, order, and benevolence, soldiers reinforced the image of the U.S. Army as a stabilizing force. The Thanksgiving dinner was thus both a humanitarian gesture and a carefully orchestrated tactical maneuver, designed to consolidate control while minimizing friction with the local population. Technological and logistical perspective. The execution of a large-scale meal in the middle of a war zone required ingenuity and adaptation. Field kitchens, designed for mobility and efficiency, were deployed to prepare hot meals capable of serving hundreds. Fuel for stoves was rationed carefully, and menus were adjusted to accommodate the constraints of available supplies. Turkeys were roasted over open flames or in makeshift ovens. Vegetables and grains were drawn from supply depots. Sugar and coffee were rationed, yet sufficient to create a recognizable Thanksgiving experience. Transportation technology played a critical role. Convoys of trucks navigated damaged roads, avoiding rubble and bomb craters, while engineers cleared paths and reinforced weak bridges. Boxes of food, blankets, and utensils were distributed with precision, ensuring that every civilian received some portion of the meal. These logistical efforts reflected both the adaptability of American forces and the broader strategic goal of demonstrating competence, organization, and goodwill. The technological orchestration also extended to communication. Soldiers carried leaflets and instructions explaining the purpose of the gathering, minimizing confusion and potential hostility. Orders from officers were transmitted efficiently down the chain of command, ensuring that soldiers understood both the cultural significance of Thanksgiving and the practical details necessary for successful execution. The combined human, tactical, and technological considerations created a singular moment in history. Civilians experienced warmth and sustenance. Soldiers fulfilled both strategic and humanitarian objectives, and logistical ingenuity ensured that the gesture was executed smoothly, despite the harsh conditions of winter and war. The interplay of these angles transformed a simple meal into a profound historical event, illustrating the complex layers of interaction between occupiers and civilians in wartime Germany. Leadership perspective. The decision to host a Thanksgiving dinner in occupied Germany reflected careful planning at multiple levels of U.S. military leadership. Commanding officers understood that small acts of goodwill could have outsized impacts on civilian morale and the perception of the Allied forces. Leaders balanced operational priorities with humanitarian considerations, recognizing that fostering cooperation among civilians would reduce unrest, prevent looting, and ease the long-term process of occupation. Orders were precise, yet allowed flexibility. Field officers were empowered to adapt menus, seating arrangements, and distribution methods based on local conditions. This decentralized approach ensured responsiveness to unexpected challenges, such as adverse weather, damaged infrastructure, or nervous civilians hesitant to approach. By delegating authority while maintaining overall coordination, leadership cultivated an atmosphere in which soldiers could act with both discipline and empathy, a duality that defined the success of this operation. Enemy perspective. From the viewpoint of the German civilians and remnants of the local administration, the Thanksgiving dinner was bewildering. Propaganda for years had depicted Americans as invaders, foreigners who brought destruction, occupation, and humiliation. Now, these same soldiers offered warmth, sustenance, and an invitation to a shared ritual. The psychological dissonance was profound. Women, in particular, experienced a conflict between ingrained suspicion and immediate need. Accepting kindness from former enemies challenged personal and cultural narratives, raising questions about loyalty, trust, and the morality of embracing aid. Some older men, still under the sway of nationalist ideology, watched silently, struggling to reconcile gratitude with resentment. This tension illustrates the broader complexity of post-surrender interactions, where civility and warfare collided, and humanity could coexist with deep-seated suspicion. Moral and ethical perspective. The ethical dimension of this event cannot be understated. American soldiers were engaging in an act of deliberate moral outreach, extending compassion to civilians who had, until recently, been considered enemies. In wartime, the line between military necessity and ethical responsibility is often blurred, but here, morality guided tactical decisions. By providing food, blankets, and cultural gestures, such as a Thanksgiving meal, soldiers asserted the principle that human dignity transcends conflict. Officers were conscious that these gestures could serve as a moral example for troops, reinforcing values of restraint, empathy, and ethical conduct even in occupied territory. Reports and diaries from soldiers indicate that many found the experience personally transformative, challenging preconceived notions about the enemy and fostering a deeper understanding of the human cost of war. Cultural integration perspective. Hosting a distinctly American cultural event in a German town required sensitivity and planning. Soldiers were briefed on local customs and potential taboos, aiming to minimize offense while maximizing the psychological impact of generosity. The act of sharing Thanksgiving, a ritual embedded with meaning in the United States, was recontextualized as an instrument of cross-cultural communication. For the civilians, this cultural transplantation was astonishing. Foods, traditions, and gestures that had been foreign suddenly became symbols of empathy and shared humanity. Women and children experienced the novelty of dishes, the warmth of communal seating, and the performative aspects of a holiday they had never observed. This integration of culture and humanitarian aid amplified the emotional resonance of the event, making it unforgettable for those who attended. January 17, 1945. The morning was brittle, with frost coating the edges of shattered windows and icy steam rising from the remnants of smoldering chimneys. The town square, scarred by artillery and debris, had been cleared as best as possible by American engineers overnight. Small groups of women and children waited hesitantly along the perimeter, their breath visible in the freezing air, hands clenched around threadbare shawls and worn mittens. The first convoy arrived precisely at 9 o'clock hours. Trucks bearing the insignia of the 7th Army rolled over the uneven streets, carefully avoiding rubble and craters. Soldiers dismounted, unloading crates of food, blankets, and utensils with military precision. The aroma of roasted turkeys and spice pies drifted across the square, mingling with the sharp scent of smoke from makeshift fires. For the women watching, disbelief stiffened their movements. Months of scarcity had taught them that generosity from strangers, especially former enemies, was improbable, almost unreal. The American officers stepped forward, offering calm instructions and gestures of reassurance. Their language was deliberate, slow, and respectful, conveying both authority and empathy. Soldiers assisted with the setup of tables and benches, aligning them along cleared pathways to accommodate families while maintaining order. Every detail was choreographed. The positioning of heat sources, the distribution of food portions, the allocation of blankets for children. It was a performance in logistics and humanity simultaneously. The civilians began to approach, first cautiously, then with growing curiosity. Mothers held their children close, eyes darting from the soldiers to the piles of supplies, unsure whether to trust what they saw. Some older women whispered to each other, questioning the authenticity of the gesture. Could it be a trap? A test? Or was it simply kindness in its purest form? The tension was palpable. The air was electric with anticipation and skepticism. For soldiers, the moment carried its own gravity. They had been trained for combat, for strategy and survival, but this was different. Each step required a measured balance between discipline and empathy. A misstep could provoke fear, offense, or chaos. A nod, a smile, a careful explanation of the food or seating arrangements became small acts of diplomacy, each contributing to the success of the event. Soldiers passed trays of steaming turkey, bowls of mashed potatoes, and freshly baked bread to tentative hands. Children peeked at the unfamiliar fare, mouths watering, while mothers hesitated, unsure if gratitude could be expressed safely. Among the civilians, the range of emotional responses was astonishing. Some women pressed forward, accepting plates with trembling hands, eyes wide with astonishment. Others remained in the shadows, observing silently, trying to reconcile the image of these Americans as both conquerors and providers. It was a psychological turning point, the moment when perception began to shift. Where suspicion and fear had dominated, curiosity and cautious hope now emerged. Every sensory detail intensified the experience. The crunch of boots on frost, the clatter of trays, the murmur of conversation in German mixed with broken English, all layered atop the surreal backdrop of destruction. Fires burned in barrels to provide warmth, casting flickering light on scarred walls. The smell of roasting turkey, a scent so foreign yet comforting, seemed almost emblematic of life returning to a desolate space. Children's laughter, cautious at first, began to break through the tension, their joy a quiet defiance against the harsh winter and harsh history they had inherited. This was a moment of convergence. The practical execution of a humanitarian mission, the emotional awakening of civilians, and the disciplined care of soldiers merging in a single scene. It marked the climax of planning, preparation, and psychological negotiation. The civilians' disbelief was palpable, yet gradually giving way to tentative acceptance. The soldiers' meticulous attention to detail and empathy was rewarded with small gestures of trust, a child reaching for a pie, a woman offering a cautious smile, a mother relaxing her grip on her child's hand. And yet, beneath the surface, uncertainty lingered. The psychological impact of receiving generosity from those who had been enemies could not be entirely measured. Suspicion and ingrained fear persisted, threading through the moment like an invisible current. It was in this delicate balance between disbelief and trust that the historical significance of the Thanksgiving dinner crystallized, forming a turning point not only for the day, but for the broader narrative of occupation, reconciliation, and human connection. The stage was now set for the emotional peak of the event, the communal meal itself, where silence, conversation, laughter, and tears converged in a single tableau that would be remembered long after the war. By late morning, the square was transformed. Long tables covered with coarse cloths and lined with benches stretched across cleared cobblestones. Fires crackled in barrels, sending thin ribbons of smoke into the pale winter sky. The American soldiers moved with a quiet efficiency, guiding civilians to their seats, offering blankets to shivering children, and filling plates with steaming portions of turkey, potatoes, and vegetables. The German women, still hesitant, took their places slowly. Hands shook as they accepted food. Eyes darted around the square, absorbing the unfamiliar yet comforting scene. The children, emboldened by the warmth and the novelty of the moment, began to explore cautiously, peeking at pies and buns, murmuring in soft German exclamations that blended with the low hum of conversation. The aroma of coffee, brewed carefully in large metal urns, carried across the square, a scent that seemed to signal normalcy in a world otherwise fractured by war. At the head of the arrangement, an American officer addressed the crowd. His words, carefully chosen and delivered with measured calm, explained the purpose of the meal, a gesture of goodwill, of human kindness, and of hope that peace might return. The tone was formal yet empathetic, bridging the gap between occupiers and civilians. It was not a speech of triumph or victory. It was an offer of shared humanity. As food was distributed, subtle exchanges began to unfold. A soldier handed a slice of pie to a little girl, and her eyes widened in astonishment. A woman, clutching a blanket to her chest, finally allowed herself to smile. Mothers whispered quietly among themselves, commenting on the generosity, the taste of the food, and the peculiarity of the ritual. The initial disbelief gradually softened into tentative acceptance. Children's laughter started to ripple through the square, hesitant at first, then gaining momentum. Their joy was contagious, breaking the rigid tension that had hung over the town since the soldiers arrived. Women, observing the children, allowed themselves small expressions of relief and amusement, hands lifting from the cold to wipe tears or adjust blankets. Even the soldiers, trained for battle rather than ceremony, were moved by the scene unfolding before them. Letters and diaries later described their astonishment at the profound emotional impact of what was, in essence, a simple meal. Photographers and officers documented the event meticulously. Frames captured women holding steaming plates, children reaching for desserts, and soldiers offering reassuring smiles. Each photograph became a record not only of humanitarian aid, but of the transformation occurring in real time. Fear and skepticism yielding to gratitude, suspicion giving way to trust. The images conveyed the depth of human emotion in the aftermath of conflict, preserving a moment where survival, empathy, and culture intersected. The sensory experience was vivid and layered. The crunch of boots in snow, the clatter of plates and utensils, the murmur of conversation in halting English and German, and the warm glow of firelight on frost-covered rubble combined to create a cinematic tableau. Even the cold, sharp winter air seemed to emphasize the contrast between hardship and comfort, scarcity and abundance, despair and hope. For the German women, the realization was profound. They were participants in a ritual alien to their experience, yet deeply resonant. The act of being invited, acknowledged, and fed by those who had once been enemies challenged entrenched narratives of fear and animosity. In their eyes, the soldiers were no longer solely occupiers. They were agents of care, bringing warmth, sustenance, and a fleeting sense of dignity back to lives overshadowed by conflict. Conversations unfolded quietly, punctuated by laughter, whispered exchanges, and cautious questions. Mothers guided children through unfamiliar customs, while soldiers explained the significance of the meal, the traditions of Thanksgiving, and the hope embedded in the gesture. The simple acts, offering a plate, passing a pie, adjusting a blanket, became profound demonstrations of empathy. By mid-afternoon, the meal drew to a close. Civilians lingered reluctantly, savoring warmth and comfort that would soon return to the harsh reality of winter and post-war scarcity. The emotional peak had been reached. Disbelief transformed into cautious joy. Fear had been tempered by human kindness, and the civilians had, for a brief moment, experienced normalcy. The event crystallized a turning point not only for the day, but for the broader narrative of human connection amid war. The Thanksgiving dinner left an immediate imprint on the town and its inhabitants. Women returned to their homes carrying more than just food. They bore a renewed, if fragile, sense of dignity and human connection. Letters written in the days following the event, later collected in archives and personal memoirs, convey astonishment and gratitude. One woman described the experience as a light in the darkness, noting how the aroma of the meal, the warmth of the fire, and the attentiveness of the soldiers had momentarily lifted the weight of fear and deprivation from her shoulders. For children, the impact was even more palpable. Many had never experienced such generosity, particularly from those considered the enemy. Their laughter and curiosity transformed the town square, if only briefly, into a space of play and wonder. Teachers and local caregivers observed a shift in behavior. Children who had been withdrawn or anxious displayed smiles, shared food, and even mimicked the gestures of soldiers, passing plates or blankets to peers. These subtle changes in daily life reflected the psychological resonance of the event. American soldiers, too, recorded their reflections. Diaries and after-action reports described an unexpected emotional depth. What had been planned as a routine humanitarian gesture became a profoundly human encounter. Soldiers noted the delicate balance required to navigate suspicion, language barriers, and cultural unfamiliarity. The success of the dinner was measured not in the efficiency of food distribution alone, but in the visible easing of fear and tension, the small gestures of gratitude from women and children, and the rare smiles that pierced months of hardship. From a military perspective, the dinner reinforced lessons about civilian engagement in occupied zones. Commanders analyzed the operation in reports sent to higher headquarters, noting both successes and areas for improvement. Coordination between supply officers, engineers, and field units had allowed a large-scale meal to proceed without incident. a demonstration of logistical capability as well as strategic insight. The event became a case study in how humanitarian gestures could stabilize occupied territories, reduce friction, and cultivate a perception of the occupying force as disciplined yet compassionate. Local German officials were present, had varied reactions. Some expressed quiet astonishment, cautiously observing that the Americans were behaving in ways that defied their expectations. Others saw the gesture as a symbolic acknowledgement of suffering, a subtle recognition that the lives of civilians, particularly women and children, still held intrinsic value. The ethical and psychological dimensions of the event were discussed in local records, correspondence, and later historical analyses, emphasizing its role in shaping post-war attitudes toward the Allies. In the days following the dinner, small but significant changes were noted throughout the town. Civilians shared stories of the event, spreading word of the Americans' generosity to neighboring villages. Mothers recounted the taste of roasted turkey, the warmth of blankets, and the kindness of soldiers to other families, creating a ripple of morale that extended beyond the immediate participants. Children spoke with wonder of pies and coffee, of laughter shared in the middle of a ruined town, and of strangers who had temporarily restored a sense of normalcy to their lives. Reports filed by officers captured both the practical and emotional outcomes. Food had been distributed equitably. No major incidents occurred. Civilians expressed gratitude. Soldiers reported personal reflections of unexpected empathy and understanding. The event demonstrated the power of small gestures to alter perceptions and bridge divides, providing a human counterpoint to the broader devastation of war. Yet the effects were not purely transient. The Thanksgiving dinner laid the groundwork for broader reconciliation efforts, influencing both military policy and civilian attitudes. Civilians began to view the occupying forces as capable of restraint, generosity, and empathy. Soldiers carried these experiences forward, shaping their understanding of civilian-military relations in occupied territories. The convergence of logistical success, ethical consideration, and human empathy made this event an enduring example of how carefully orchestrated humanitarian action could leave lasting emotional and historical impact. The Thanksgiving dinner reverberated far beyond the immediate town square. In the weeks following the event, American officers noted subtle but measurable shifts in civilian behavior across surrounding villages. Women who had previously approached soldiers with suspicion now offered tentative greetings. Children displayed curiosity rather than fear. The psychological impact of receiving human kindness amid war's devastation created an environment where cooperation became possible, and the groundwork for reconciliation slowly took hold. Cultural memory played a significant role in this process. The dinner became a touchstone for civilians' later recollections, a symbol of humanity in a time of despair. Photographs taken during the meal, later published in newspapers and archives, preserved these moments for posterity. Women described in letters how the simple act of sharing food, the warmth of fires, and the attentiveness of soldiers had reshaped their understanding of Americans. Children, now capable of speaking about these experiences years later, remembered the taste of unfamiliar dishes, the novelty of desserts, and the rare laughter that echoed across a ruined town square. The American military recognized the broader implications of the gesture. Reports highlighted not only logistical efficiency, but also the long-term benefits of psychological stabilization. These accounts were used to guide future occupation policies, emphasizing the importance of humane treatment, cultural sensitivity, and moral leadership. By demonstrating respect and empathy, soldiers could reduce resentment, prevent unrest, and foster cooperation. The Thanksgiving dinner thus became both a historical and operational example of how humanitarian acts could support strategic objectives. On a local level, the dinner influenced social dynamics within the town. Women, emboldened by the experience, took on more active roles in coordinating aid and maintaining community networks. Children, inspired by the rare moments of normalcy, engaged more openly in play and school activities, where feasible. The psychological effects of this brief respite were enduring. Even as scarcity persisted and winter's hardships continued, the memory of warmth, generosity, and human connection provided hope. The event also carried ethical and moral weight. Soldiers, accustomed to the rigidity of military orders and the stark realities of combat, reflected on the profound human impact of their actions. Many described a deepened understanding of empathy and responsibility toward civilians, recognizing that even small gestures could have lasting consequences. Diaries and letters reveal that these soldiers left the town with a renewed appreciation for the human dimension of war, a lesson that would shape their conduct in subsequent operations and occupations. In historical terms, the Thanksgiving dinner stands as a singular example of cultural diplomacy during wartime. It illustrates how occupying forces could balance strategic objectives with humanitarian imperatives, creating moments that bridged divides, softened resentment, and fostered goodwill. For German civilians, particularly women and children, the event became a narrative of resilience and recognition. It demonstrated that even in the shadow of destruction, acts of generosity could restore a sense of dignity and humanity. The symbolic significance extended into post-war reconstruction. Stories of these gestures were recounted in local memoirs, oral histories, and academic studies, highlighting the broader role of Allied occupation in shaping social and cultural attitudes in defeated Germany. The Thanksgiving dinner, though brief, became emblematic of the potential for reconciliation, a moment where empathy and careful planning converged to leave a lasting imprint on civilian lives and collective memory. The immediate relief, emotional resonance, and enduring legacy of the Thanksgiving dinner set the stage for reflection on its broader implications. Beyond logistics, strategy, and morale, the event invites a contemplation of the human capacity for kindness, the significance of cultural exchange, and the enduring power of symbolic acts amid devastation. This leads naturally into the reflection/closure, where the philosophical and emotional significance of the event is considered in a calm, historical perspective. The Thanksgiving dinner in that frozen Germantown was more than a meal. It was a convergence of history, humanity, and hope, a fleeting yet profound interruption of war's relentless rhythm. In a landscape defined by destruction, hunger, and fear, the simple acts of sharing food, offering warmth, and acknowledging civilian dignity created ripples far beyond the square where the event took place. For the German women and children, it was a rare affirmation that even amidst devastation, compassion could endure. The event also revealed the deliberate interplay between strategy and morality. American soldiers, trained for combat, executed the dinner with precision, yet their actions were guided by empathy as much as by orders. It demonstrated that military operations could be infused with humanity, that acts of care could complement tactical objectives, and that ethical engagement was not a contradiction to occupation, but a tool to stabilize, restore, and connect. Leadership, foresight, and planning allowed a ritual so culturally distant to resonate deeply with civilians who had known only deprivation and fear. Culturally, the dinner symbolized the bridging of divides. The unfamiliar traditions of an American holiday became a shared experience, highlighting that human connection can transcend nationality, ideology, and the scars of conflict. For children, the memory of laughter, food, and warmth persisted long after the winter had passed. For adults, it was a moment of dignity and recognition that offered hope for a more humane future. Historically, the event reminds us that war is not only measured by battles and destruction, but also by the choices made in the spaces between. In small acts, distributing a plate of turkey, passing a blanket, or offering a smile, soldiers reshaped perceptions, fostered understanding, and left a legacy of empathy. The Thanksgiving dinner endures as a testament to the resilience of civilians, the moral capacity of soldiers, and the enduring power of human kindness in the midst of war. In the quiet aftermath, when the fires dimmed and the snow settled over the ruined town, a fleeting warmth lingered, not just in stomachs, but in hearts. It was a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, humanity can find a way to shine.